your lake by force!
Then bring soldiers, not signatures, Fiona!
She stood at the edge of my property, stilettos sinking into the damp grass, waving a stack of papers like a sword. "Mr. Maddox," Fiona Langley said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the lake wind, "the board has voted to seize this lake, effective immediately." Her tone was rehearsed, righteous, and wrong. I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch until the sound of the rippling water filled it. She hated that, the quiet. It made her lose control. "You can't own a natural resource," she continued, chin lifting in defiance. "It belongs to the community now." That's when I stepped closer and said the words that stopped her mid-sentence. "Fiona, I built the filtration system beneath this lake. It still pings back to my server." For a moment, she blinked, calculating. The clipboard queen didn't like unknowns, and I just handed her one too big to process. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, stay with me and hit subscribe right now, because this showdown isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming what's yours when the system tries to bury you. I'm Derek Maddox, engineer, son of a soldier who promised never to let corruption swallow peace. My father and I restored this lake by hand, bag after bag of soil, bolt after bolt of steel. He's gone now, but every ripple still carries his reflection. That's why this isn't about water. It's about memory, about honor. The board chair flipped another page on her clipboard, the motion deliberate, meant to intimidate. "You've been warned before about unauthorized fixtures," she said. "The HOA will assume custody and maintenance immediately. Any resistance will be considered obstruction." Her assistant, a young man in a crimson tie, avoided my eyes. I could tell he wasn't built for confrontation. The tyrant in heels thrived on it. I bent, scooped a handful of lake water, and let it pour through my fingers. "You're trespassing," I said quietly. "This shoreline's boundary predates your charter. I have the original deed and the hydrology maps to prove it." Her smirk didn't waver, but her knuckles whitened around the clipboard. "Then we'll see you in court," she spat, heels clicking as she turned back toward her silver SUV parked at the edge of the gravel path. She didn't realize she'd just declared war. The enforcer in crimson wasn't the first bureaucrat to threaten me, but she was the first to make it personal. The lake wasn't a trophy. It was a promise I made at my father's bedside, one I intended to keep, no matter what form the attack took. As she drove away, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and something metallic. I watched the clouds darken over the water, the reflection of my house trembling across its surface. That's when I noticed the new sign she'd ordered installed near the cul-de-sac. "Property of Silver Pine Estates HOA, access restricted." They hadn't just declared intent, they'd begun occupation. I felt a weight settle in my chest, not fear but resolve. Fiona Langley believed her authority was absolute because no one had ever tested it. Most people folded. I don't fold. I measure, I adapt, I counter. The officer of rules thought she could drown me in paperwork. She hadn't yet realized I lived by tides stronger than her ink. And as the first drops of rain broke the lake's surface, I whispered a quiet promise to the water itself. "They'll regret touching you." Because in Silver Pine, every ripple hides a current, and mine had just begun to rise. By the next morning, word had spread. Half the neighborhood already knew that Fiona Langley had legally seized my lake. She was efficient, like a storm dressed in crimson. Her SUV was parked at the entrance again when I returned from town. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 men in reflective vests stood beside her, measuring tape stretched across my shoreline like it was some construction site. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping out of my truck. The clipboard queen didn't even look up from her tablet. "Verifying the new property boundary," she said, her voice smooth but loud enough for the onlookers across the street to hear. "Per board order, this land is now under HOA jurisdiction." I laughed, just once, quietly. "That's funny," I said, "because last night I filed an injunction with the State Water Division. You're trespassing on a federally protected watershed." Her head jerked up then. The enforcer in crimson froze for half a heartbeat before her lips curved into that familiar, patronizing smile. "Empty threats, Mr. Maddox. Your little puddle doesn't qualify for federal anything." Behind her, one of the men muttered, "This isn't right, Fiona. There's no environmental clearance for—" She cut him off with a glare. "Finish the measurements." I could feel the tension roll off them. The kind that clings to people forced to obey someone they don't respect. I took a step closer. You think I'm bluffing, I said, but you'll find out soon enough what it means when you threaten an engineer who designs systems for the Department of Defense. That line landed harder than I expected. The officer of rules blinked twice, hiding a flicker of doubt before turning back toward her car. You have until Friday, she said coldly. After that, we drain it. The words hung there, cruel and absurd. Drain it. As she drove away, I noticed something she didn't. One of the workers, a woman with short hair and a hesitant posture, lingered near the water line. Her badge glinted under the sun. Laura Chen, Environmental Compliance Division. She looked at me for a moment, almost apologetically, then followed the others back to the SUV. That was the first time I saw her, the conflicted witness I didn't know I'd need yet. I walked back toward the dock, my boots sinking into the mud. The lake was calm, its surface glassy, reflecting the overcast sky. It had been my father's dream to see this place restored, to prove that something broken could still give life back. Now, it was under siege by people who'd never lifted a shovel in their lives. The board chair didn't understand what she'd just set in motion. To her, it was about control and signatures. To me, it was about legacy. Every bolt in the dock, every stone on the shore, had been placed by my hands, and his. When I reached the cabin, the phone was already ringing. It was my neighbor, Samuel. "Derek," he said, breathless. "They're sending letters to everyone, claiming you've been hoarding community water rights. Fiona says you diverted the lake for personal use." I closed my eyes. "She's playing propaganda now," I said. "Yeah," he whispered, "and people are starting to believe her." That was her power. Fiona Langley didn't need proof, just volume. She spoke loud enough that reason drowned beneath gossip. But I wasn't about to let her win through noise. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Environmental Compliance portal, scrolling through state filings. That's when I saw it. An upload time-stamped 7:42 a.m. that morning. The HOA had filed an altered survey under her digital signature. She'd forged the boundary map. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of what that meant. The tyrant in heels wasn't bluffing. She was building a legal trap, one that would swallow the lake unless I exposed her before it reached the county office. The storm had officially started, and as the wind picked up outside, scattering leaves across the water, I whispered to myself, "You wanted a fight, Fiona. Now you've got one." By the time Friday arrived, Silver Pine Estates didn't feel like home anymore. Every neighbor I passed looked away, some out of fear, others out of convenience. Fiona Langley's rumor mill had worked faster than rainfall on loose soil. The board chair had turned my name into a warning, a whispered reminder of what happens when you challenge her authority. That morning, I found another letter nailed to my gate. Final notice of enforcement, signed personally by the clipboard queen herself. The message was short, but the tone dripped with satisfaction. Failure to comply with the board's order will result in immediate removal of unapproved structures and reallocation of natural water assets. In plain English, they were coming for the lake. I tore the letter down, the nails scraping against my palm. That's when I saw her again. Officer Laura Chen, standing near the end of the path, pretending to inspect the culvert. She wasn't in uniform this time, just jeans and a navy jacket, but the nervous way she kept glancing over her shoulder gave her away. When our eyes met, she hesitated before walking over. "Mr. Maddox," she said quietly, "we need to talk. Privately." Her voice carried the tension of someone who'd crossed the line just by speaking to me. Inside my workshop, surrounded by rusted tools and blueprints of filtration pumps, she pulled a folded paper from her bag. "I wasn't supposed to see this," she whispered. "Fiona submitted it as part of her lake seizure plan, but there's a problem. It references a non-existent permit number." I frowned. "Non-existent?" She nodded. "The document's been falsified. Someone's trying to bypass environmental oversight entirely." For a moment, the world went quiet except for the hum of the generator. The enforcer in crimson had overplayed her hand, and this woman was the proof. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she continued. "I shouldn't be telling you this. She's already threatened my department's funding if anyone questions her filings. But what she's doing, if it goes through, it'll drain your lake and flood the lower wetlands. Families could lose their property." That's when I realized the scale of it. Fiona Langley wasn't just coming after me. She was playing God with the entire neighborhood's ecosystem. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "Because my brother used to fish here," she said softly. "Before he passed, this lake was the only thing that calmed his seizures. I can't stand by and let her destroy that." There it was, the conflicted witness, torn between her duty and her conscience. I could see the fear in her posture, the way her fingers clenched around the folder like a confession she wasn't ready to release. "Keep the document," she said, sliding it across the table. "If she finds out I talked to you, I'll lose my job." I didn't argue. I just nodded, grateful but aware of the weight she'd placed in my hands. After she left, I studied the fake permit, its forged signatures, the mismatched dates. The tyrant in heels thought she'd buried her crime under bureaucracy, but she'd forgotten something critical. I'd spent a decade in government contracting. I knew every digital footprint a false file left behind. That night, I sat at my desk, tracing Fiona Langley's forged trail through the county database. Each click led me deeper into the maze she'd built, layers of deceit masked by legal jargon. But buried beneath it all, I found what I needed: an unlisted contact at the State Environmental Bureau. Her plan could still be stopped, but not without exposure. The storm outside thickened, thunder echoing off the water like cannon fire. I looked out the window, watching lightning ripple across the lake's surface. That reflection, the same one my father once stood over, felt like a reminder. You can't let them take this. Tomorrow, I'd make my move. But before I did, I'd have to survive the retaliations. New was coming, because people like Fiona Langley never slept quietly when their control was threatened. I woke to rain and the trucks already on site. By midday, a line of muddy rigs blocked our entrance. Fiona Langley walked the shoreline like she owned everything today. The clipboard queen smiled while contractors drove stakes into soil. They called it emergency remediation and claimed public safety reasons. The enforcer in crimson nodded while Collins set up pumps. A notice appeared on my gate with a cold tone. Immediate removal demanded within 72 hours, signed by Fiona. 72 hours to strip everything that mattered most: force. My chest tightened, breath became thin and angry and cold. I called Laura Chen. Her voice came low and steady. She warned about county liaison, fast-tracked emergency claims and allies. A deputy drove slowly past, radio buzzing like warning light. At the meeting, Fiona smiled, her cadence practiced and precise. She called it flood mitigation and liability prevention for neighbors. The board chair repeated phrases until people nodded in agreement. Neighbors who once waved now avoided my eyes politely everywhere. The tyrant in heels had friends who answered every call. They boxed the shoreline with stakes, tape, and machines now. Collins, the contractor, told me pumps would run non-stop today. He shrugged when I demanded permits and legal proof immediately. A squad car rolled through like an ominous punctuation mark. The deputy's stare suggested this was sanctioned and official now. Inside my mailbox, a letter from legal threatened fines soon. The community hall smelled of coffee and thin sympathies tonight. Fiona Langley stood center stage and tilted the narrative deliberately. She painted me stubborn, careless, and obstructive to progress public. A woman sobbed quietly. Someone clutched a dog tight nearby. The enforcer in crimson watched with a satisfied, calm smile. Later that night, my truck bore 3 fresh, deep scratches. It felt like a message, anonymous, and edged with threat. I parked at the far edge and walked back slowly. At my workbench, I spread the permit Laura had handed. The paper looked ordinary, but margins hid a falsified signature. Someone had forged a liaison's name to cloak the action. They had manufactured legitimacy with speed, trucks, and polished words today. Momentum was their weapon. Volume made things seem true often. They'd escalated beyond conversation into procedure and theater. Fiona's network moved faster than I could breathe sometimes easily. But they underestimated small facts and a stubborn past history. My father had taught me how to read landlines. I traced old sketches and the lake's natural spillway map. The tree by the rock marked boundaries, no stake rewrite. They tried to erase memory with tape, stakes, and noise. I thought of the rock my daughter kept for luck. It sat in the pocket of my coat like promise. Outside, the rigs hummed, their lights blinking like trapped insects. Inside, I opened the contacts I'd found the night before. State lines, bureau numbers, an unlisted liaison's direct extension now. Tomorrow I'd call each desk and trace the chain carefully. Tonight I made lists, folders, and quiet, determined plans alone. They wanted spectacle. I'd gather law and fact in response. I would not meet force with equal fury, but leverage. Fiona Langley believed momentum could bury inconvenient truth and shame. She'd mobilized friends, contractors, and a chorus of assurances today. But signatures can be questioned, permits verified, calls recorded easily. I laid out copies, photos, and a list of witnesses. Laura's whisper had been an accidental overhear that mattered deeply. One neighbor, Mrs. Klein, had seen men hauling pipes dusk. Her hands shook when she recounted trucks parked near Reed's. Another man, Jorge, had photos time-stamped 24 hours earlier today. I mapped each testimony onto the lake's old topography plans. The victory strategy shifted from conversation to official complaint filing. They wanted the illusion of legality. I would disrupt narrative. Tomorrow, I'd start calling desks, filing complaints, and pressing onward. I went to the county records terminal at first light, because some answers hide behind paper, and some behind hours when no one else cares. The public terminal room smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. A clerk swept in the corner. I sat, inserted the free access card, and pulled every file linked to the drainage project we'd been lied to about. The search returned a small stack, a preliminary permit, a contractor's name, and a scanned approval that looked wrong at a glance. The signature font didn't match the county's verification style, and the approval stamp had been layered like a half-finished collage. My palms were steady. Paper tells the truth if you know how to read the lies people leave behind. Back home, I spread the screenshots across my kitchen table under the lamp I've had since Ellie was born. The lamp made the pixels sharp. I cross-referenced the contractor name against the state license database. There it was. But the license number led to a different address and a business profile that had been dissolved 2 years before the so-called emergency began. Whoever filed the permit had used an expired contractor identity. Whoever the board chair called a trusted partner had been dead to the registry for months. That wasn't an oversight. That was a cover-up. When I called the number listed for the permit liaison, an automated voice recited a forwarding menu and then fell silent. I dug deeper online. Digital footprints reveal what people pretend to erase, and found a cached photo of trustees at a ribbon, cutting with a logo that matched the permit header. The image tags listed a PR firm that didn't want to be connected. I tracked a payment through a municipal invoicing portal. A payment moved from the HOA's account to an account with a shell company's name, and then filtered into what looked like a construction escrow. Money has a way of naming the guilty. On the second night, I drove out to the real contractor's listed yard, a dusty lot with a single pickup and a faded sign. The owner, a man with a sunburned forehead, squinted at my photos and said, "We were never hired for that. Our number's been cloned more times than good sense." He tapped his temple. "Lots of bad actors around here, but your board, they didn't copy this for charity." He refused to sign anything at first, then agreed to write a sworn statement after I promised it would help stop more damage. His statement would become another small, sharp thing the board couldn't spin away. I thought about how the enforcer in crimson, Fiona Langley, the clipboard queen, had stood at meetings and smiled while people argued. She'd called code on neighbors whose hedges were a hair too tall. But she also cut clandestine checks for midnight streams. That cruelty in neat pleats made me angrier than the theft itself. I found pages showing a pattern, approvals labeled emergency, filed within hours of heavy rains, bypassing environmental reviews that should have taken weeks. I pulled county floodplain maps and overlays. The diversion route intersected protected riparian buffers. It wasn't incidental. It was engineered. I realized then that professional exposure was my path. The victory strategy had to be technical and irrefutable. I arranged for an expert consultation with a hydrologist I'd worked with once, someone who read water like a book. If he confirmed illegal diversion, I wouldn't be waving opinions at a room full of neighbors. I'd hold a certified report with dates, signatures, and calculations. That kind of evidence compels inspectors to act or forces officials to explain their silence. Technical facts leave less room for the smiles of a tyrant in heels. Before I left the terminal, I printed everything, 2 copies, and slid them into a folder. Outside, the morning had warmed. I drove back past the diversion and watched water slip where it wasn't supposed to. The creek looked calmer than it felt. I had evidence now, and evidence changes the rules people pretend to live by. I called the hydrologist before noon and described what I found. He asked for the GPS coordinates and promised a preliminary look within 48 hours. I also scheduled a meeting with a county inspector. On paper, an innocuous appointment. In reality, it was the first pressure point. When technical people speak, politicians listen, and then some. The river had started to feel like a living jury by the time I went back. I parked on an unused pullout and walked the bank in the late heat, boots sinking into mud that smelled of iron and old leaves. The diversion channel gurgled as if apologizing for what it did. Water that should have slowed out across the wetland instead ran like a hose toward the clubhouse foundation. I met with the hydrologist at the site. He was smaller than his reputation, with a sketchbook full of notes and the kind of gaze that goes straight through excuses. We walked the flow line together while he snapped measurements and muttered calculations under his breath. "They altered the channel geometry," he said finally, "and they've increased downstream velocity. That bank erosion, engineered." He tapped the soil with a probe, and the metal thunked like an accusing gavel. When he explained what he'd seen, culverts undersized, silt fences installed as theater, grading that directed runoff into a narrow sluice, I felt both vindicated and sick. The enforcer in crimson had weaponized development, and neighbors had paid the price. My hands found the familiar split in an old fence post. I leaned on it as if it could hold my anger at bay. The hydrologist drew a diagram in the dirt with a stick and then asked me a question that made my jaw tighten. "How far will you go to stop this?" That was the line, not rhetorical. I thought of Mrs. Leary's willow losing roots the week her basement flooded, of the duck pond choked with mud, of the club's manicured lawn untouched by the damage it caused. I thought of Fiona Langley, her smile during meetings, the clipboard queen who'd learned how to make policy sound like prophecy. I thought of the way she dismissed concerns with a pen tap and a patient head tilt. I promised that I wouldn't let her paper masks keep hurting people. Back at my workshop later, I started turning measurements into action. The hydrologist's data let me map a timeline, what they did, when rains followed, and which properties suffered. My background in civil surveying let me translate sketches into coordinates inspectors respect. I printed annotated maps and overlaid photos of the altered channel. Those maps were not just diagrams, they were a ledger of consequences. I called a county inspector and left a terse voicemail with GPS points, dates, and the hyphenated phrase that gets attention: possible unauthorized alteration. At dusk, I visited neighbors, knocking on doors that had become battlements in town hall arguments. Some greeted me with eyes that still wore worry like a second face. Others asked to remain anonymous. Fear is reasonable currency in a small place. One neighbor, a retired engineer named Paul, slid me an envelope and said quietly, "I kept my notes." Inside were sketches from meetings showing proposed drainage that never matched what was built. His hands trembled when he spoke about being ignored. The conflicted witness I needed was starting to unfreeze. We arranged for the hydrologist to do a formal site report the next morning and booked a meeting with a local environmental reporter later that week. Public exposure wasn't my first weapon, but it was a lever. If technical proof met a camera and a news editor, the board's tidy narrative would unravel fast. I also sent a time-stamped message to Fiona. No threats, only facts and the steps we were taking. Her silence came back like a closed door. I slept badly that night, waking to the sound of distant water and the memory of boots in mud. The victory strategy had to move from discovery to pressure. Evidence gets meetings. Meetings force answers. Answers change outcomes. I wouldn't just notice. I was going to be the man who built the case that made the damage stop. I promised to see it through. I met Paul at dawn in the diner because confessions travel better with coffee than with subpoenas. He sat in a corner booth, hands cupping a steaming mug, eyes fixed on a grease-stained menu like it could hide him. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, a waitress stacked chairs and hummed. Paul pushed a folded sheet across the table, as if it were a live wire. At first, he couldn't speak. He tapped the table, a nervous metronome, then told me the thing I both needed and dreaded. He'd signed the grading plan at a board meeting a year earlier. "I thought it was routine," he said, voice thin. "They had plans, signatures, everyone agreed. I didn't look close enough." His admission landed like a thrown brick. The retired engineer named names and moments, and when he said Fiona Langley, the air in the booth seemed to thin. He explained how meetings had felt hurried, how the board chair smiled while contractors shuffled papers, how the clipboard queen, Fiona, kept insisting the plans were fine. He winced when he said her name, torn between old loyalties and the truth. Then he slid another packet toward me, copied emails, short notes, timestamps. They were small, banal things, phrases like, "Thanks for the quick turnaround," and a line about adjusting the channel to improve landscaping. The language didn't match care for safety. Paul's hands trembled as he described the night he drove the diversion route with a flashlight and noticed a lowered outfall, a change that sped water toward properties below. He'd raised concerns afterward and had been brushed aside. "I let it pass," he said. "I didn't push hard enough." He kept repeating "I," as if the word could bind the loose screws of the past. Then he reached into his coat and produced a thumb drive. "I recorded them," he said simply. He hadn't planned to keep anything. He'd meant to remind himself of the conversation. The file, he said, had captured a contractor laughing about how they tweaked the grading to move runoff, so the clubhouse stayed pristine. It was casual, a throwaway line, but in that throwaway lay intent. We walked to my truck and I plugged the drive into my laptop right there in the parking lot. The audio had the soft clatter of chairs, a contractor's voice, and that terrible casualness. Talk of speeding up runoff, and a nervous chuckle when someone said, "It'll never reach them." Hearing it made the fury close and precise. This wasn't accident, it was choice. Paul slumped like a man who'd been carrying a secret too long. "I should have done something sooner," he said. "I'm sorry I waited." I couldn't fix the night the water rose, but I could use what he brought. I outlined the next steps: file the recording with the county inspector, hand copies to an environmental reporter, and prepare a sworn statement from Paul linking the audio to the altered grading plan. Those moves would turn a whisper into proof. He hesitated, then nodded. "Fiona will fight," he warned. "She always fights." I pictured the tyrant in heels smoothing her voice at meetings, the enforcer in crimson making rules feel inevitable. There would be denials, legal threats, a public smear. But with an admission from a board-adjacent engineer, maps showing the altered channel, and a recording that captured intent, the board's story would crack. When we left the diner, the sky had lightened. Paul walked straighter, relief and fear braided into his step. The conflicted witness had shifted from paralysis to purpose, and that shift changed everything. We weren't only a handful of neighbors anymore. We had leverage that could compel inspectors, rally press, and protect the people who had already suffered. We moved with a slow, purposeful urgency toward justice now. Next, we'd coordinate inspectors, brief attorneys, and warn neighbors to document every. I spent the afternoon turning chaos into a plan. After Paul left, I mapped every piece of evidence across the neighborhood: the altered channel, the emails he'd given me, the recording on his thumb drive, and the list of contractors who'd worked for the board. Each pin was a small, undeniable fact. First move: neutralize the denials. The board chair would lie, she'd posture, she'd threaten lawsuits. Fiona Langley had already shown she knew how to make rules feel inevitable. She'd grin, smooth her blazer, and call it a misunderstanding. So, I scheduled a meeting with a licensed civil engineer who owed me a favor. He agreed to drive the diversion channel with me at first light and to assess whether the grading changes violated county stormwater codes. His opinion would turn speculation into profession. Next, secure official attention. I called the county inspector the engineer recommended and asked for an urgent site visit. I didn't mention accusations, only safety concerns and altered runoff observed after recent grading. When the inspector asked for documentation, I handed him my map and Paul's recording and asked that he treat the matter with priority. I wanted the inspector to arrive before Fiona could craft her public denial. Parallel track, shore up community support. I printed a concise flyer explaining what we'd found and left copies at the post office, the community center, and the cafe on Briarwood. I knocked on doors, met faces from meetings, and asked a single favor: document anything unusual with photos and times. People nodded, some with anger simmering, others with fear in their eyes. Naomi, a retired teacher, offered to help collect signatures. Media was a controlled burn. I had worked reporters before. I knew their hunger for a human angle. Paul would be the human angle, the conflicted witness who'd chosen right. I wrote a short factual pitch and emailed it to a local environmental reporter, attaching a sanitized timeline and an offer to meet at the site. I let the evidence do the shouting. If a reporter showed, Fiona's soundbites wouldn't matter next to photos, maps, and an inspector's note. Legal cover. I consulted an attorney briefly to understand the fastest injunctive remedies if the inspector confirmed wrongdoing. A temporary restraining order could stop contractors from finishing any further work, but it required an evidentiary foundation. The attorney told me what we'd need: expert testimony, a chain of custody for Paul's recording, dated photos of altered grading, and sworn affidavits from neighbors. That list became our checklist. I also set a simple trap for the clipboard queen. If Fiona tried to organize a board meeting to gaslight the community, we'd ask for the meeting minutes, require a recorded vote, and demand contractors disclose contracts in writing. Public records that would be hard to explain away. The tyrant in heels loved formality. She relied on it. We'd weaponize it. That night, as streetlights blinked on, I updated my map and typed a message to Naomi and a handful of neighbors. Inspector visits Friday 9 a.m. Bring cameras. Be ready. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, equal parts adrenaline and exhaustion. This wasn't petty revenge, it was a methodical dismantling of a dangerous plan. Fiona Langley would respond. The enforcer in crimson would posture, accuse, and try to control the narrative. But with an engineer's report, an inspector's attention, sworn neighbor statements, and a reporter on standby, the board's denials would be brittle. We were no longer a few scattered voices. We were a network with deadlines, evidence, and legal anchors. The plan was surgical: turn intent into proof, denials into documents, and secrecy into public scrutiny. If we did this right, the officer of rules would find she couldn't rule by bluff any longer. The next morning would tell us if it worked. No theatrics. Just measured pressure. I started the morning at the county records office, trading the warm street air for the steady hum of fluorescent lights and whispering printers. People moved with purpose. I felt oddly calm. The engineer's sketches from yesterday sat under my elbow, annotated with his clinical handwriting. We had to turn those sketches into an unassailable timeline. First task: lock down dates. I requested grading permits, contractor invoices, and any recent change orders tied to the diversion. The clerk frowned. These requests make boards nervous, but when I said I represented neighbors with safety concerns, things opened. I photocopied plats, highlighted signatures, and marked timestamps. Each stamped page was a small, irreversible step. Next, I met Naomi at the boat launch. The river smelled of silt. The current whispered like a warning. We walked the bank where Fiona Langley's crew had pushed earth and redirected water. Naomi handed me a thumb drive with photos. Muddy tire tracks dated. A time-stamped video of heavy equipment at night. Drone stills showing abrupt channel changes. I felt the weight of every image. Faces in my community had become evidence. Back at my truck, I called the engineer and asked him to finalize a short expert affidavit for the inspector. A 2-page summary he'd sign, explaining why the grading likely violated stormwater rules. He agreed to meet at noon. His signature would turn our concerns into technical authority. I thought of the clipboard queen and her predictable denials. Technical words sting less than accusations, but they cut deeper. Then I visited Paul at his workshop. He slid the original recording across the workbench and watched me as I played a portion. His jaw tightened when Fiona's voice said, "We needed the channel for aesthetics." The recording held candid admissions that the board chair had known more than she'd admitted. Paul agreed to sign an affidavit and to let me notarize the thumb drive. Chain of custody mattered. I also arranged a small media move. The environmental reporter I'd contacted wanted the engineer's notes and to stand with the county inspector when he toured the site. I sent the reporter a concise package: a map, the engineer's summary, and a polite request to cover Friday's inspection. Reporters like clear visuals and a schedule. At mid-afternoon, I ran the plan by Naomi and 3 neighbors in the community center kitchen. It felt odd to strategize over paper plates and coffee, But that ordinary setting was our strength. The community would look like a living stakeholder, not a political stunt. We rehearsed what to say when the inspector asked questions. We practiced pointing to specific photos, not emotive statements. We practiced staying calm when the clipboard queen showed up to interrupt. We also set a small trap if Fiona tried to legally block us. Naomi had a contact at the county attorney's office who understood HOA dynamics. We quietly asked how fast a temporary restraining order could be issued and what evidence would meet the threshold. The answer? With an engineer's affidavit, documented alterations, and eyewitness statements, the county could act quickly. That gave us leverage. Finally, I sent everything to my attorney and labeled it for emergency injunctive relief. I emailed the inspector the engineer's summary and asked for a confirmed time. I told the reporter we'd be at the launch at 9 a.m. on Friday. I loaded the thumb drive into my pocket and felt suddenly exposed and ready. Fiona Langley would show up. The enforcer in crimson would try to gaslight the inspector, spin the narrative, and rally sympathizers. She thrived in chaos. But we'd rehearsed order, documents, experts, witnesses, and a reporter's camera. If she hid behind procedure, procedure would expose her. That night, I slept in short bursts. The plan felt brittle and real. Come morning, we'd see whether careful pressure could crack a fortress of arrogance. I was not afraid. I woke before dawn, and the river sounded like a rumor I couldn't ignore. Naomi texted a single line, "Inspector, 9 o'clock, be there." By the time I pulled on boots, the air had that iron edge that makes decisions feel inevitable. We met at the bank, a small convoy of neighbors carrying printed maps and stubbornness. Paul had his drone. Naomi carried a binder that felt heavier than paper. The engineer's affidavit was clipped inside. Each packet we handed out felt like a small contract with truth. The county inspector arrived in a dull truck, official and unflappable. He walked the altered embankment with a steady, professional attention, boots sinking where the earth had been turned. He measured slopes and angles, compared our drone stills to the culvert elevations, and scribbled in shorthand. When he asked for contractors' names and dates, my throat tightened. But we had organized, and we handed him what he needed. He paused over the drone photos, then over a twilight video of heavy machinery working past midnight. Evidence is patient. It waits for someone to show up with facts. Fiona Langley arrived later, perfectly composed, blazer-like armor. The board chair smiled like a press release. In the mud, it looked brittle. The enforcer in crimson tried a few practice lines about community aesthetics and emergency misunderstandings. She attempted to charm the inspector, a public relations performance she'd rehearsed. He listened politely and kept asking for details that belonged to engineering and to permit logs. Her answers slid off like drops from a waxed car. The clipboard queen's composure was a veneer. The county rules were not interested in veneers. We walked him to the diversion head, where the culvert had been widened and rerouted. The concrete edges told the true story. Cuts too neat for a landscaping oversight, silt lines leading like fingerprints toward the storm drains. He photographed the altered flow channels. He recorded coordinates. He asked about runoff management plans. The county's stormwater code is merciless in its precision. One misdirected channel creates liability that follows like a shadow. I pointed to the oak at my property line, a living witness whose root system had felt the first change in ground movement. The inspector crouched and felt the compacted soil. He nodded once, small and serious. Neighbors lined the opposite bank like a jury of ordinary people. Their faces were tired and fierce. Grandmothers folded their hands. Teenagers stood awkward and alert. The community's presence made the facts heavier, harder to dismiss. Paul volunteered his workshop log and time-stamped videos proving overnight equipment runs. Naomi handed over the thumb, drive with the night footage and drone sweeps. Her hands didn't shake. The inspector accepted the media with the calm of someone used to translating chaos into procedure. By noon, the county official placed a temporary stop work directive on the river modification and scheduled an emergency hearing with the environmental division. The paper he handed me was small, but it carried weight. Legal teeth, an order to halt further channeling, and a date when the board would have to answer under oath. Fiona's expression changed as if a stage light had been cut. The tyrant in heels made a couple of quick calls. The officer of rules tried to regroup her volunteers, But the legal lever had been set in motion, and that sound is louder than any PR campaign. The inspector warned us to secure more witness statements and to expect resistance, appeals to aesthetics, sudden claims of prior permits, or an attempt to muddy timelines. He suggested we deliver formal, signed affidavits and the engineer's formal report before the hearing. We had both ready. We'd anticipated every predictable pivot. That afternoon shifted into action. My attorney drafted the emergency petition. Naomi canvassed neighbors for statements. Paul compiled logs and timestamps. I coordinated with the reporter, who wanted a pre-hearing feature. Public exposure would amplify the inspector's orders and limit the board chair's ability to spin. We turned our nervousness into a plan, and our plan into momentum. As dusk fell, I stood beneath the oak, watching the clubhouse lights blink on like a defiant constellation. Fiona Langley's silhouette flickered behind curtains. The county had acted because we had shown up with experts, witnesses, and recorded proof. The strategy we'd built, expert observation feeding official authority, had been implemented. Now we waited for a hearing that could shift liability away from our river and toward those who'd tried to pretend their shortcuts were harmless. Exhaustion sat in my bones, but under it there was a narrow, hard relief. We'd moved the pieces into legal motion. The victory still felt distant, but the mechanism had engaged. If the hearing went our way, the consequences would reach beyond our cul-de-sac. If it didn't, we'd still made the river's defenders visible. Either way, we'd stopped being the quiet people who watched things happen to them. The hearing room smelled faintly of wood polish and unease. Rows of folding chairs creaked as neighbors settled in, whispering among themselves, eyes darting toward the front table where Fiona Langley sat flanked by two board members. The clipboard queen wore confidence like perfume, heavy, deliberate, and suffocating. Her crimson blazer caught the fluorescent light, a warning more than a wardrobe. I took my seat across from her, papers stacked neatly, every line of evidence ready. The county inspector sat between us, expression unreadable, while the environmental attorney prepared his notes. Naomi and Paul were behind me, one calm, one visibly trembling. I leaned back just enough to whisper, "Whatever happens, we hold the ground, not the emotion." When the chair called the hearing to order, Fiona was first to speak. The enforcer in crimson launched into a performance polished by practice. How the project was a beautification initiative, how the community supported improvements, and how the river redirection was minimal. Each phrase dripped with rehearsed benevolence. She even invoked a misunderstanding caused by a few disgruntled residents. I let her talk. Lies work best uninterrupted. Then came the shift. The inspector opened his folder and spoke with measured clarity. Our preliminary investigation found unauthorized alteration of stormwater flow. Permit documentation does not align with field observations. The words landed like quiet gunfire. Fiona blinked once, her smile tightening. The officer of rules tried to regain control, waving her hands lightly, pretending surprise. "Surely you're mistaken," she said. "Our contractor was fully certified." That was my cue. I slid a folder across the table. The engineer's signed affidavit, time-stamped drone images, and the sworn statements from neighbors. "Certified contractors," I said evenly, "don't reroute natural waterways under cover of night." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Naomi's drone footage played next, grainy video of construction lights flickering against wet soil at midnight. Paul's recording followed, Fiona's voice unmistakable. Aesthetics matter more than flow data. Whispers rippled through the room. A few board members shifted, their loyalty eroding in real time. The clipboard queen straightened in her chair, jaw tight. She accused me of manipulation, of violating community unity, of spreading lies. I countered with one sentence. "Facts don't care about your titles." The inspector spoke again, confirming that the county was recommending a cease and desist order and environmental remediation at the board's expense. He listed potential fines and liability risks under state code. The audience's murmurs grew louder, some gasps, a few suppressed cheers. The board chair's face froze between rage and disbelief. Fiona tried to pivot, offering a dramatic apology on behalf of misunderstanding, insisting that the board had acted with good intentions. It was a politician's plea, hollow and late. The tyrant in heels had lost her footing. Her voice cracked when the inspector added, "Intent does not exempt liability, Mrs. Langley." When the gavel struck to adjourn, the crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in collective relief. Neighbors who'd been silent for months stood up, clapping. Others simply exhaled. Naomi's eyes shimmered. Paul's hands were trembling, but his expression was steady. Fiona Langley gathered her papers with trembling precision, each motion smaller than the last. The enforcer in crimson, who had once ruled by fear, now looked small beneath the bright, impartial lights of accountability. Outside, the air felt alive. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as they asked if the community planned to sue. "Not yet," I told them. "We just wanted our river back." The quote would run by evening, and I didn't care how it sounded. The board chair exited minutes later, sunglasses hiding eyes that had lost their conviction. She didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. Power is loud until it collapses. Then it whispers, begging not to be noticed. As the crowd dispersed, Naomi placed a hand on my shoulder. "You think she'll recover from this?" she asked. I looked toward the horizon, where the river cut through sunlight again. "People like her don't recover," I said. "They just find new rules to hide behind." But for once, the rules weren't hers. The morning after the hearing, the air over Briarwood Lake felt different. Lighter, sharper, almost cleansed. The sun scattered across the water like it finally recognized who it belonged to. I stood on my porch with a mug of black coffee, staring at the reflection of the oak tree bending over the ripples. For months, that tree had been the silent witness to everything. The arguments, the digging, the loss, and finally, the reckoning. Fiona Langley's house sat just across the lake, its lawn still marked with tire tracks from the county trucks. The board chair's crimson SUV hadn't moved since last night. Word had spread fast, faster than even she could control. The enforcer in crimson, once the queen of bylaws, had become the subject of whispered pity and thinly veiled gossip. Neighbors who used to nod obediently at her clipboard now crossed the street. The tyrant in heels had lost her stage, and without her audience, she looked smaller in every sense of the word. I didn't rejoice, not in the way she would have. There's a strange quiet that comes after victory, a silence so deep it forces you to sit with what it cost. For me, that cost was time, sleep, and the constant reminder of how fragile peace can be when power is unchecked. For my daughter, it was the fear that home could be taken from us. For my neighbors, it was the realization that silence had made them accomplices. By noon, the county's environmental team arrived to start the inspection work. I watched from the dock as they measured sediment levels and water displacement. Naomi walked over with her notebook, exhaustion and pride sharing space on her face. "They're saying the remediation could take weeks," she said, "but the river's turning clear again." "That's all that matters," I said. "Clarity always wins, one way or another." She smiled faintly. "And Fiona?" I looked toward the far side of the lake. The clipboard queen stood by her porch, arms crossed, phone pressed to her ear. She was trying to sound authoritative, but even from here, you could see it, the way her free hand trembled, the way her stance had lost its certainty. The officer of rules was no longer enforcing anything. She was defending herself against a system she'd once weaponized. The local reporter's story had already gone viral overnight. HOA board accused of illegal lake diversion, county orders restoration. Her name was in the headline. The video clip of her arguing with the inspector had been shared thousands of times. The comments section had turned her into a symbol, the face of arrogance undone by accountability. When the environmental truck pulled away, Paul joined us. He was quiet, but the relief was clear in his eyes. "You think she'll ever say she was wrong?" he asked. I shook my head. "People like her don't apologize. They rewrite their story until they believe it." We walked the perimeter of the lake together. The sound of rushing water filled the air as the county pumps rebalanced the flow back toward its natural channel. Birds had returned, small, fluttering shapes cutting through the morning haze. It felt like the world exhaled. As we passed the community board notice, I stopped. Fiona's name had been scratched off the list of officers. A plain white paper had replaced her title. Board elections to be held next month. I smiled. It wasn't revenge, it was renewal. The same neighbors she'd bullied into silence were now lining up to rebuild what she'd broken. That night, I sat by the lake again, my daughter beside me, sketching the scene in her notebook. "You really think it's over?" she asked quietly. "Maybe not forever," I said. "But tonight, yeah, it's ours again." She leaned her head on my shoulder as the moonlight rippled across the water. Somewhere across the lake, a single porch light flicked off. Fiona Langley's house fading into darkness. For once, she wasn't watching us. The board chair, the tyrant in heels, the enforcer in crimson, all of her personas, had finally dissolved into silence. The lake, once stolen, was free again. And freedom, I've learned, doesn't roar. It hums. It flows. It remembers. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.